Hi, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh, and welcome to today's video where I'll be asking you the important question. Do you dream of lost worlds? Of ancient civilizations filled with fabulous forgotten technologies? Of vast stone temples raised to the power of unspeakable gods? Do you dream of visiting the Hollow Earth? Of taking a walk through the gardens of Atlantis? Of worlds filled with savage beastmen, beautiful princesses, monsters and dinosaurs? Well, you're not alone. Victorian novelists dreamed those same dreams, and they chronicled them all across a series of novels, stories and other literary works. And my mission is to take you on a deadly, dangerous journey through the realm of lost world literature. Is that dramatic enough? So, welcome to the weird and wonderful place that is Victorian Lost World literature. Although perhaps calling it Victorian might be stretching things a little bit. Most of it's a Victorian period, but some of it is later and the first part of the 20th century. It just seems easier to call it Victorian, to be honest, because that's where it really began. Now, I have 3 works to share with you today and to review, and the first of them is The Last Lumerian, a Wesralian romance, which is by G. Firth Scott. Now, this was originally published in 1898, and the text does reflect the attitudes of its time. So I have to share with you a trigger warning. I hate to do this because I don't believe in trigger warnings. I think they're kind of vaguely patronising, but this one is quite a serious one. There are quite a number of racial slurs in the first few chapters directed to the indigenous Australian population. So be warned, if you pick up the book, you do have to put up with that. Moving swiftly on, the story concerns a guy called Dick Halwood, who is the manager of a small sheep station in Australia. Now, he's unfairly fired from his post for suspected embezzlement, and he, in disgust, decides to set out for the gold diggings in the west of the country, the Westralia that was referred to in the title of the novel. Now, along the way, in the bush, he runs into the Yellow Hatter. Now, the Hatter, a Hatter, was a bushman, apparently, who wasn't obliged to tell you his true identity. I don't know how true this is as a thing, or whether it's something Scott created for the purposes of his novel, but that's the situation. The Hatter tells Halwood this rather incredible story about a land of gold which can be found out in the outback, which is at the bottom of a range of mountains, and the gold is so big, apparently, chunks of it, that you can just pick it up off the ground. The only slight problem is that the country is guarded by a 20-foot tall golden-skinned woman, the Queen of Lumeria, and her friend, the great crocodile monster, the Bunyip. Now, so surprisingly enough, Halwood goes along with this, and more on that later, and they actually, after some privations, they do arrive at this oasis at the bottom of some mountains, and yes, they have arrived at the edge of the ancient city of Lumeria. Now, let's be perfectly honest here, this is inspired quite obviously by H. Rider Haggard's She. That was the key work that kicked off the whole Lost World literature thing, so it's no surprise to find a lot of those tropes here again. We've got the ageless queen, who's basically ruling over a ruined civilization, and she's got a whole bunch of slaves who just do whatever she says. There's also a romantic element which involves a huge amount of reincarnation as its fundamental building block. So this is all pretty familiar stuff. There is some wild and fun elements thrown in here which are new, including vampirism, and that really seriously helps keep things moving. There has a good pace. The prose is pretty readable as well. So all this seems to shape up for quite an interesting adventure. but there are issues, I'm afraid, that I have with this particular book. And the main one, strangely enough, it sounds really weird to say it, it's a lack of realism. Yeah, and a story about a 20-foot woman made of gold. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you see, if you're going to come up with a story like this, if you're going to tell it and make it credible and get the audience involved, you basically have to ground it in some kind of reality. And by that I mean the actions and behaviours of the main characters have to ring true. They have to be credible and feel authentic. And here, I'm afraid they really don't particularly. I mean, to give you an obvious example, I mentioned that Halwood goes along with this scheme of the Hatter's and it seems a bit strange. Well, he does that because the Hatter hypnotises him. And later on, at the pool, before they kill the Bunyip, he does it again. Now, you think this is going to be a major part of the plot of the rest of the novel, but it's not. It's just completely forgotten. There is no actual justification for the Hatter having hypnotic powers. It's just not mentioned again. It's just a plot device. And plot devices come thick and fast here, I'm afraid. One of the other major problems I have with it is the structure of the book is really badly flawed. We have our two heroes. They're at the edge of Lumeria. They con the Queen into leaving the gold outside. They grab some of the gold and they head off back to civilization. That's fine. Once there, Halwood plans to go to Europe to live the rest of his life on the proceeds of the expedition. Fine. The Hatter's going to go along with it. Fine. Until at the last minute he decides he's not going to go along with it at all because he's in love with the Queen of Lumeria, who he saw for about 2 minutes, and she's 20 foot tall and made of gold. But apart from that, it seems like a good plan. So he's going to go back there and see her again. But what he insists is that Halwood takes all the gold with him when he leaves for Europe. Everything. He doesn't want a penny. And Halwood is reluctant, but he accepts it and he goes. Which leaves the Hatter completely flat broke, with no money to raise supplies or equipment for another trip to Lumeria. Seems like a bit of an oversight, that. Anyway, after spending a year in Europe, Halwood is kind of getting a bit dissatisfied and decides to come back. So he goes back to Australia, and I can't remember what his actual adventure. I think he's going to Melbourne eventually. But anyway, along the way, the boat has to stop somewhere. I think it's Adelaide. It has to stop for supplies, and he just decides to stretch his legs out on the quay, and there he runs into the Hatter, who is of course destitute and broke. And together, again, they decide, okay, we'll go back to Lumeria. So they head off on a second expedition there. This time they're saddled with 2 other guys who've kind of like latched onto them, and off they go. And they get there, they're back at the pool, at the oasis, at which point these other 2 guys take their share of the gold and leave. Now, their presence isn't completely pointless because one of them actually is the key to the Hatter's true identity, although he doesn't realise it at the time. So this does actually play into the way the story eventually wraps up at the end. However, that's their only purpose of being there. And what we have Halwood and the Hatter back at Lumeria, exactly where they were 50 pages ago, with the story having not moved forward at all. And that's about a third of the length of the book. That's almost the whole of the middle, the second act, if you like. It's just completely pointless. And you can't help thinking that a good editor would have just pointed that out and said, you've got to streamline this and put some more story in there. If this other guy needs to be there to know the Hatter's true identity, then get him on the first expedition. Don't have him just be there for 5 minutes on the second one. It's just, as I say, this comes back to this business of plot devices. Scott has some themes here, like destiny and fate, reincarnation. Those kind of things are his kind of like his touchstones for his story. But honestly, they just seem like excuses for outrageous plot contrivances a lot of the time. So that's kind of one of the major flaws I felt about the book. That middle section really feels completely redundant. There's also a total lack of world building. Lumeria is simply a series of passageways and empty chambers made of gold, yes, but they're empty. There's nothing in them. There's nothing happening. The Queen, I have no idea how she spends her time. She's just there with her slaves who are never identified individually. They're just a group of slaves. There's no sense of how this society works, what it might have been once. There's just absolutely no effort at world building whatsoever. And again, to me, that was just an incredibly major flaw. Similarly, the bunyip, that's a real part of Australian folklore, by the way. But it exists in this story simply for the heroes to kill it. Really, its association with the Queen of Lumeria, which apparently lasted hundreds of years, is never explained in any way whatsoever. They were just associated somehow or other. So yeah, there are a lot of weaknesses in the plotting here, to put it mildly. What I would say is that it's not completely lacking in fun. I mean, there is a good pace to it. It's not a bad read if you fancy a Lost World adventure. Just don't expect too much of it, really. Don't expect it to be a well-plotted, fully rounded experience, because it's not. So, although it's superficially entertaining, it's not particularly satisfying. Now, the second book I want to talk to you about today is this one, The Smoky God, written by Willis George Emerson and published in 1908. Now, this is a story about an old Norwegian sailor called Olaf Jansen. And on his deathbed, he entrusts a record of a voyage he took with his father when he was a boy to his next door neighbour, who is the one who provides the wraparound narration. Now, this voyage began in Stockholm. It travelled up the coast towards the Arctic Circle, stopped at various fishing ports along the way, but his father suggests exploring further north, trying to find the fabled land beyond the north wind. And they do find it. A forested green land where they meet a race of 12-foot-tall giants. And they spend the next 2 years travelling through this land, which they realise is the Hollow Earth, before they exit at the South Pole. Now, this is an early Hollow Earth novel. Now, the underworld obviously is a concept that's been present in the mythology and the folk tales of every civilization that has been alive on planet Earth. And the Hollow Earth itself was proposed as a scientific theory by none other than Edmund Halley, or Halley, the comic guy, who basically based his theory on what were inexplicable compass readings of the time and some fake information involving the density of the Earth, which was later put right by none other than Sir Isaac Newton. Interest was revived in 1812 thanks to the work of a guy called John Cleves Sines Jr., who was the first to propose that there were entry and exit points at the poles. And other writers joined in over the next few decades or so, until we get to 1906, where interest really was piqued by the publication of a book called Phantom of the Poles by William Reed, which was not a novel, it was a factual book which sought to explain the strange phenomena that had been observed at the poles, particularly at the North Pole. And in 1908, in July, Admiral Peary, the famous explorer, left New York on his way to the Arctic for his 8th expedition there. So, in short, 1908 was the perfect time for a Hollow Earth novel, or a novella in the case of The Smoky God, because in this reprint it runs only 74 pages, and the amount of time that the voyagers spend in the inner Earth is only about 20 of those. Now, that's because Emerson is very keen to establish Jansen as a credible, authentic witness whose word can be trusted. And to that end, we also get copious footnotes. only they're not really footnotes because they're inserted in the main body of the text, and I'm afraid these do appear with monotonous regularity. Now these are quotes, writings from established scientists, real-life explorers, and basically they're there to justify what Janssen has just said in the previous paragraph of his tale. There are even a couple of biblical passages inserted in this way, and even if there's no obvious, overt effort to push Christian ideology, the main settlement within the Hollow Earth is called Eden, which seems a bit on the nose. So perhaps the question we should be asking here is, what was Emerson trying to achieve with this novel? Was he trying to pull off some kind of literary hoax? Was he claiming that this was a real-life account of a real-life voyage? He certainly seems far more concerned with establishing the authenticity of it than he does with creating anything like fictional drama as such. Was it perhaps a case of him poking fun at the Hollow Earth conspiracy theorists of his time? Is it a satire? It's kind of hard to say, and there's really doesn't seem to be any information out there which really supports any particular view. So why couldn't this just be an example of fantastical fiction? Well, if that was the intent, it's a pretty much of a failure, I'm afraid to say. There are several problems, and the first one is the fact that you only really have the two main characters. I mean, the only other characters specifically identified are the ruler of the Hollow Earth realm, who makes a one-scene appearance, and a giant called Jules Galdea, who kind of acts as their interpreter, language teacher and guide. It's mentioned in passing a couple of times that he has a wife who never appears. That's the entire cast. There's also a complete lack of world building. We never find out how this society works at all, what technology they have, anything about it. Well, apart from the fact that they're all fun-loving and extremely hospitable, which means there's zero conflict with our two main characters and zero drama. Just nothing. So what we're left with is basically just descriptions of the physical nature of the Hollow Earth, some of the flora and fauna that they see, the landscape that they pass through. That's pretty much all you get. There's no real story. They go, they see, they come back. That's kind of about it, really. Not much else happens. So is it worth your time? Well, if you're a Lost World literature nut like me, maybe, I suppose. But if you're looking for an entertaining adventure or something to get your teeth into, really, it's very, very skippable. So the last one I'm going to talk with you about today is this obscurity called Husky Hillier by Captain Webster. Now, this was first published in 1930 or 1932 or 1934. I've seen all three dates quoted, and I think I probably can make a guess as to why that is. It was also known as the Odyssey of Husky Hillier, and that probably makes more sense with the title, which I'll go into in a little while. Now, but first, let's read the blurb on the front here, because Husky Hillier is the monocled daredevil known as the modern Captain Kettle. Now, that'd be fine if I knew who Captain Kettle was. Maybe he brewed a good cup of tea. I'm really not sure. Now, given that blurb, what I was expecting from this was some boy's own adventure. And if you're not familiar with that particular term, it basically was a catch-all term for literature aimed at preteen and teenage boys in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. It derived from a series of similarly named magazines that were published in both the UK and the US. And if you lived in the UK, Boy's Own Adventure meant Biggles, the World War I flying ace, or Bulldog Drummond, characters of that nature. Basically, any hero who played it with a stiff upper lip and a straight bat and stuck it to Johnny Foreigner on behalf of the British Empire. And there was no lovey-dovey girly stuff in it, no. No. Women were not to be trusted. They weren't as bad as Johnny Foreigner, obviously, but they were not to be trusted. Now, as you might expect from that description, Yeah, we're looking at another trigger warning territory here about racial slurs, because Webster clearly had no time for some particular races. To be specific, Webster has no time for anyone who speaks Italian or Spanish. He has no time for Jewish people or Germans. On the other hand, though, he is actually quite sympathetic towards indigenous African peoples, although some of them are portrayed as insurrectionists and crocodile worshippers. Others get actually quite a heroic portrayal here. Husky has absolutely no time for slavery. He finds it completely repugnant and takes on some slave traders at one point. He frees all their slaves and actually takes the slave traders, puts them in shackles and takes them to the slave market where he sells them, which kind of goes into a bit of a moral grey area, really, doesn't it? Because that kind of makes Husky a slave trader himself. Now, Husky travels the world with his sidekick Mike, who's a disgraced former soldier who was court-martialed. He hadn't actually done anything wrong, of course. It was a matter of honour. Now, they look for adventure wherever they can find it, normally off their own bat, but sometimes carrying out missions on behalf of the British Foreign Office. Now, my explanation for the different publication dates and why I think The Odyssey of Husky Hillier is a far more appropriate title is that this does not read like a novel. This reads like 6 short stories followed by 2 short novellas, one of 2 chapters, one of 4 chapters. There are connective moments between the stories, but it was only after a while that I realised that everything was taking place in a linear order. Now, the last section of the book does feature a cult of crocodile worshippers, but it's not really Lost World fantasy fiction in the same way that the first 6 stories aren't. It's chapters 7 and 8 that really concern us and qualify for its inclusion here. So in chapters 7 and 8, Husky and Mike are on a snake hunt in South America and accompanied by some highly dubious foreigners. A strange girl wanders into camp and one of the foreigners tries to have his way with her. Husky stops it, of course, and later kills the guy when he catches him cheating at cards. Now, this girl obviously turns out to be the Queen of El Dorado, although for some reason Webster never refers to it by that name. He always calls it the Golden City. And also, this is a Toltec civilization where most historians agree that if there is such a place as El Dorado, it was likely involved as a fable of the Muisca tribe, not the Toltecs. Because of his heroics, Husky is offered the role of king consort. But there's a problem. A priest has recently tried to rob the Toltec treasury, and he's due to be executed. And Mike and Husky can't let that happen because, and I quote, "If nothing else, he's at least a white man, and I'm pretty well certain a Britisher into the bargain." So this is pretty standard Lost Kingdom stuff, although I would say the surprising appearance of the Toltec's god does take things into the realms of the truly fantastical, and it's an extremely welcome moment and the best thing in the entire volume. Captain Webster was usually published as F.A.M. Webster, but there is a very conscious effort made here to present him as a military man and a world adventurer and traveller. And it also mentions that he's heavily involved in the creation of amateur athletics in the UK. And it does sound like he's had a very colourful life. And before you think this is all some kind of PR hogwash, actually if you read about it, it is all true. So in summary, despite some eye-rolling moments, this is a reasonable enough read. It's entertaining enough, just about. There's not a huge amount of a Lost World element. Just don't expect anything too imaginative or too memorable. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for staying with me till the end of the video and my first journey into the murky realm of Lost World literature. As we've seen, a very variable place in terms of quality. Of the 3 I've talked about today, I would have to say my least favourite was The Smoky God. I would say that's probably not worth your time unless you're a Lost World fanatic like me, and even I didn't think much of it. Second was probably Husky Hillier. That's kind of entertaining, but there's not a huge amount of Lost World element to it. it's fine, it's okay. And almost by default, my favourite was The Last Lumerian by G. Firth Scott. This is a book with some major flaws and some major issues for me, but it's fun to an extent. It's got some interesting elements to it. I would say it was the most interesting of the three that I've read for this video. So that's it for today. Please do all those strange things that people want you to do at the bottom there with the buttons. And I'll see you next time, hopefully. Cheers.